morning again, Green Spring. It's March the 19th, 2018, and today we have in the studio John Roosma. Now, I've had John Roosma in the studio before. Back in September, we talked about the history of the Air Force. It was the 70th anniversary of the beginning of the U.S. Air Force as an independent branch. And so we talked about the history of the Air Force, starting with 1909 when the first aircraft was bought by the U.S. Army Signal Corps as the first aircraft in the long line of aircraft, and winding up with the more recent ones. And then in December, we got a little exotic and we went to the moon. And we talked about the different stages and the processes that it took to get to the moon, John discussing all of those. And today we're going to go back to square one, and we're going to talk about the beginning of flight, the beginning of the successful flight of the Wright Brothers in 1903. So John, welcome again to Village in Motion and Green Spring Village. We're certainly delighted to have you.
Thank you very much. And the topic of Wright Brothers is very just. It's something that most people just kind of say, oh yeah, the Wright Brothers, but what'd they do to get an airplane in the air?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, you really are sporting the Wright aircraft, aren't you? Right.
Well, you got to advertise your product.
I see.
Yeah.
Oh, let's talk about the Wright brothers, Wilbur and Orville, right?
Right. The two brothers. What was unique about them is that they were very industrious. Very. They high school education, barely a high school education.
Were they graduates?
No, they weren't graduates, but they were. They were vociferous readers. They read all the time. If something came up, they'd go to the library and get an encyclopedia and study it. Matter of fact, Wilbur, because when they later on started really doing some aerodynamics, taught himself calculus.
Oh.
I mean, that's the level that they worked on, and because everything they did, and they solved problems by scientific method, defining the problem, possible actions, course of action, discussion, and then solution.
They even invented a calculating machine, as I recall.
Orville made one.
Orville did.
Yeah.
Was he the smarter of the two? Or the more mechanical?
I don't know. They were very
both of them
pretty much smart men. They were really and dedicated in their work. Everything they did very meticulously and analyzed did all their projects with thought.
So they got involved in making bicycles. I presume that was just to make money, is that?
They started the bicycle company roughly in 1892, and they were doing very well because at that point...
Slide on the bicycle. Go ahead.
Yeah, at that point the bicycle was coming back in, the new department brakes and et cetera, and they were doing a very good business.
And it was a nice looking bicycle.
Yeah.
As a matter of fact, it looked a lot like the bicycle I had in 1940.
Probably much like it is today. They, anyhow, we have a bicycle in the museum, a Wright Brothers bicycle, besides all the other artifacts we have for it. We have one whole gallery dedicated to the Wright Brothers. So, how do they get going?
How did they get interested in flight?
Well, a guy by the name of Otto Lilienthal, a German, was gliding in Berlin. He'd actually built himself a hill, and he had over 1,000 glides, and was really doing like sail gliding, parasailing gliding today. And unfortunately, he got into a situation where he couldn't correct what he was doing, and he crashed and was killed.
And that impressed the Wright brothers, didn't it?
Well, not only did it impress, but it got everybody's attention. He'd been doing this over there, and it was somewhat known, but for them, they got thinking there and said, gee, I wonder why he crashed, or I don't know. And then one day, Wilbur was sitting there, and this is a box that has the inner tube for the bicycle. Yeah, and he was twisting it back and forth, and he said, if we had top of the wing here, bottom of another wing here, and we twisted and turned, I bet you we could turn the vehicle. And that's, in essence, what they came up with. It's called wing warping, and we'll see that more and more as we progress into the field.
Okay.
How they decided, well, we have to test this concept. So they went through, and we got to get a
kite.
A kite there.
The next slide.
Yeah.
And with the kite, we were able to test.
The kite, there
it is.
The kite had strings hanging down. It's only a small kite. It's only 5 feet. But you had to get out and get the kite airborne also.
And we see, is that a canard, or that tail is on the kite to help?
It's a little canard. It was just not for elevation. It was just to keep it something to help steady it up. That's what they thought they needed. And the controls worked well. There were 4 strings, 2 from each wing, and they could sit on the ground and pull one another and maneuver the kite that way, and it worked very well.
So this was 1899, is it?
1899, and then at that point they said, hey, well, we got to find some place where we can go practice this, but we need wind. One thing we need is wind, because otherwise we can't get it going.
Also, they wanted a bigger. Well, didn't they study the airflow and things like that from? They got books on aeronautics and stuff.
Well, yeah, but they got a lot of data. They wrote to the Smithsonian.
Yeah.
They wrote to different people who were the gurus of the business of the day. But don't forget, not many people were talking about aviation.
No.
And not much had been written.
Unless you had a bird or two.
A bird, right, exactly. But anyhow, with that and working, and they said, hey, this is a great concept. Where we want to go? Well, let's try Kitty Hawk. We'll go down there and have a look-see. And it was great. They had the wind they want.
That was because of the winds and the sand.
Yeah, well, the sand is very nice because it does 2 things. If you're going to crash, you might as well do it in nice soft sand.
Thinking ahead.
Number 1. Number 2, secrecy at the time. In that time frame, the Outer Banks is not what Outer Banks are today.
Yeah.
There was no one out there, just a few people here and there. So from that point of view, it was a good location. A little difficult to get to. The first time they went down there, it took them a week. From Dayton to get out to Kitty Hawk. And then, so
now they take a glider, which is the next slide.
Yeah, okay, they took the glider, and they said, okay, we're going to go down there and see how it works.
What's the wingspan on it? You know, about 20 feet?
The first one was 17 feet.
17 feet?
Yeah, and 17
So this is much
feet.
Bigger than that box kite they had.
Oh, yeah,
5
feet, 17 feet. And they could, here's a picture, you notice as they're holding that up as a kite.
And they must have the strings to pull to cause the wing warping.
Right.
And test it.
And it worked.
Yeah.
And so they said, okay, well, this is working pretty well.
And this is 1900.
Yeah, and they were. The last day they were down there, Wilbur decided he was going to hop on and see if he could roke it. And it worked, but the aircraft did not have good lifting capabilities. Yeah. So back to Dayton they went. They're going to get ready for 1901. And now they came back in 1901, and they had a pretty good flyer. This one now, we went up to 22 feet.
But 1901, isn't that the one where they had a broader chord, and they made the wings just a little bit longer, but it wasn't really successful, was it?
Well, actually, just what you said, they changed the shape of it because they'd gotten all these figures from the various institutions, Smithsonian being one of them, who said, oh, this is the data you need to figure out your lift and drag, and they came up with that. And they said they came up and put the 1901 model as using those figures.
Yeah.
Well, it didn't work.
Yeah.
It got some lift, but it just wasn't doing well. So they said, well, what are we going to do? I don't know. They just said, let's go home. They went back to Dayton. Orville even said, hey, well, nobody's going to fly in 1,000 years from now.
Yeah.
So they went back, and they were hanging around there, and they said, you know, maybe the data they gave us is wrong. And of course, they were from the position, who are we to say, we're just a bunch of guys trying to figure this out, and all these other people gave us these figures. Maybe the figures are wrong.
So they actually had equations for lift and drag that had been developed over the years using kites and things like that.
Exactly, from other people.
From other people.
And so they said, okay, let's go check. How are we going to do this? One of the first things they did is they mounted a platform on a bicycle, and they pedaled around and saw how the aerodynamics worked on models. And then they said, well, let's really get to it. And then they went in and built themselves a wind tunnel.
So let's see the next slide.
Yeah, are we up to the wind tunnel? No, another one.
The next slide is the wind tunnel.
Yeah, there you go. They built themselves a wind tunnel. If you can imagine, wind tunnels have been around before.
Oh, had they?
Oh, yeah. They didn't invent the wind tunnel, but they invent the utilization of it to discover aerodynamic capabilities of things.
Okay.
And so that's what they did.
Let's see the next slide.
And within there, okay, that's inside the wind tunnel, and
those are different shapes.
Different shapes. They came up with over 200 different shapes, generating which ones generated the better lift, the less drag, etc. And with that in mind, now they
So now they had empirical data to test their equation.
Right. Exactly.
And they found out that they found out that the coefficient of lift that they'd been using all this was wrong.
0.005 seconds.
Yeah. And it was considerably wrong, huh?
And they came up with and made that correction, which, by the way, is still in being today.
Oh, the same coefficient?
Same coefficient of drag. So they then came up with the 1902 glider.
Okay.
Okay.
And that's on the next slide.
Yeah, that you can see it right here. Look at that. What did we do in 1902? If you notice in the stern portion of that, you can see a rudder, what we would call a rudder today. And you had they called the front rudder, the front elevon a rudder anyhow. So there you see a picture of it, and they're gliding. Well, the glides were done very well. The lift was working well. Everything working well, except when they went into a turn. And when they went into a turn, the airplane just went discombobulated itself.
I might see the next slide too. It was the same. It's the same plane, only in a different configuration.
Yeah. Okay. That's the same airplane. You can see the tail, the rudder and the tail and the nose. And as I said, the shudders and stutters they got when they went into a turn were just what you happen today. If you want to stall an airplane, you pull the nose up, it'll stall out on you and fall off on a wing.
Now this is the glider that's in the museum, right?
Yes, it's in the museum.
So you can go down. Is it downtown or is it out?
Downtown.
Downtown.
Yeah,
Okay.
we have a whole Wright gallery downtown.
Oh, you have?
With all the airplanes. We got the 1901 glider in there, well, a 17-foot glider. And then we had the two, and of course we have the one we really like to see. But it was interesting. They came up and said, "Oh, well, something's happening here. We're not doing something right." And so they said, "Well, we have the tail back there. Why don't we have the tail or rudder turn in the direction we're turning? Because we know the higher wing is generating more lift when they're going into a turn." So they said, "Well, wait a minute. We only got two hands. We got all these things we're pulling."
Yeah.
So
well, let's see the next slide.
Orville said, "Well, why don't we tie it into the control system?"
Okay.
So the operator is, when he goes into a bank, a left bank, the rudder will turn left, or right bank right, and that's what he did. And so that worked beautifully. They started getting fantastic glides. They did over 1,000, or around 1,000, but one of the longest ones of that 1,000 was 622 feet by Wilbur.
Oh.
Now
can you explain the control on this figure?
Yeah, pretty much. No, not really. But anyhow, you can see that what's good there. It shows you the three axes of reliability. You got the pitch, roll, and yaw.
Okay.
And
the pitch is what?
That's the X, Y, and Z axis.
Okay.
So you can see on there, you got pitch. Pitch is up and down. You got roll this way, and then the worst one you have, not worst one, but the
yaw. Huh?
The yaw, which of course is the adverse yaw, and that's why by making the rudder turn in the direction, solve the problem.
Okay.
And then from then, of course, now what do you do? Well, they went back home. They said, we're going to have to get an engine. We've done all the gliders 1, 2, and 3. Let's make the flyer. And so that's what they did. They they said, well, wait a minute. We got to have propellers on here. We got to do something. So they built themselves a propeller, and because of all the action they did with the wind tunnel to get the shapes, they knew aerodynamic shapes would work well that they came up with. So they said, okay, a propeller is not a propeller like you have on a boat. A propeller on a boat is like when you put a screw into wood. Yeah. But a propeller for an airplane is an aerodynamic airfoil, and it generates a lift. You know, if it's
they actually thought that.
Oh yeah, they said
great.
it.
Yeah.
That came out with the tables. So now they had to do is carve themselves a propeller. Nobody else was carving propellers in those days, so they carved a propeller. And along with this, they said, hey, how about we're going to need an engine. Go
and
find an engine.
We didn't have many engines back then, did we? I mean,
well, they had engines, but they were big.
Yeah,
they needed a very light engine, and they only need an engine generating roughly 12 horsepower.
Did we actually have the Henry Ford automobile then, or was it?
Oh yeah,
that was about the time, 1901, I think. Henry Ford came out.
Well, I don't know exactly.
Well, we had automobiles a little.
There were tons of gasoline engines around.
Big ones, so heavy.
And they said, okay, well, we can't find. We got to make one. So they started making one, and they. Did they do it themselves, or did they have somebody else? No, they did it themselves, but they had a mechanic in there who was an excellent mechanic, and he was really helping them. Charlie Taylor.
Oh, okay.
And Taylor did a great job helping them out. And then they said, okay, we got to rig this on there. We got to make it a little bit bigger. We're going to go to 40 feet now. And we went from 32 to 40 feet. And surprisingly enough, when you look at the airplane, you say, oh, it looks like it's equal length, 40 feet, right? But you notice the pilot is set off to the right.
The next picture, there we go. No, the one that's it.
Yeah, well, you can see the pilot is offset to the left.
And
in this case, the engine sits on his right. Because of that extra weight of the engine on there, they made the right wing 4 inches longer.
Oh, okay.
But it's still 40 inches across.
That's a good picture of the propellers, too.
Yeah.
Maybe we could zoom in on that just a little.
And the thing about the propellers that's unique is that they said, wait a minute, if we have all this weight spinning around, it's going to generate a lot of torque.
Okay.
So why don't we have one go clockwise and the other go counterclockwise, and they'll eliminate the torque. And it did.
How'd they do that?
Well, that was, of course, it's chain driven. The propellers are chain driven. And they
twisted the chain.
The left propeller on all their airplanes, the chain to the left propeller is always twisted, making it turn in the opposite direction. We didn't have anybody else do that until a P-38 came out in World War II, which worked very well also.
Yeah. Well, did we have any other twin? Well, we don't want to take up too much time on that, but let's go on.
Yeah, no, go on. Ask the question.
I wondered if we didn't have too many twin-engine aircraft. We had the tri-motor, which was back in the 20s, but and we had the DC-3, which was before the P-38.
Oh yeah.
But the DC-3.
No, all the transport airplanes will always have just plain engine turning.
And they were all turning in the same direction.
Yeah.
Okay.
The standard engine, because well, just an aside right now, the P-38, they finally started to have trouble with it because logistically, because you go to a base and you need a new engine. Well, all we got is right engines. Well, the left engine's broken, you know, so they just. I understand, and I've got to research this a little more. Towards the end of the war, they just put one turning engine. Both engines turn the same way.
Oh, okay.
Okay. So. But that's interesting in that way. All right, now we're up to that point. Now we got a test. So we're going to go back to the beach. They went back
The next slide.
in the latter part of the year, 1903. And when they got down there, they're building the airplane right there.
Yeah.
But they were also simultaneously, they were using the 1902 glider for practice. And they practiced, and they practiced, and they practiced. You figure these guys at this time were the leading aviators in the world. Yeah. Nobody else was doing this.
An interesting thing about the airplane, looks like the wings are drooping.
Yeah, it's almost like a negative dihedral or anhedral. They built it that way. They just came up with that. It's the only airplane they ever built that way. The rest of them either straight or some.
Did they understand the concept of dihedral? Or
I don't know. I assume they did.
Yeah.
But their biggest thing was getting this thing in the air.
Yeah.
And so they started working on it in September, but then, of course, they had some problems. The propeller shafts that held this, the wiring that held it broke.
Oh.
And here it is in latter part of the year. They had to go back to Dayton, get another one. And
that wasn't a short
twice,
trip.
Back
they
to
just
Dayton
didn't
and
take
come
a
back.
hop up there, did they?
Then they got them both in there, and now we're coming along, and it's December 14th. And December 14th, Wilbur, they flipped a coin. Wilbur got the.
He either won or lost, however you look at it, huh?
And he got in there and crawled in there and took off. Well, he didn't get very far. The airplane leapt into the air and then right straight down, almost inconsequential, really not flying per se. And so it got a little banged up. That was on the 14th, so they spent the 15th, 16th repairing it. And when they got it all fixed, now it's Wilbur's turn. And on December 17th, 1903, they cranked it up, and off he goes. First flight.
There we go.
Yeah, that is the actual shot you see right there. And you can see one of the workbenches right there where they were. It was unique. They had a big camera there, and Wilbur said, "Okay, when you see air between sand and the skids, squeeze the bulb."
That's it.
So that's the picture, the most famous airplane picture going right there. And
Okay, so now we've had our first flight.
well, let's finish on that. They flew three more times that day, and the last flight was for 59 seconds, 852 feet.
Which really proved you could fly.
They really did it, because they did. And now it's time to go home. It's December. Well, they really didn't. They were going to stay there and do some more flying that day, but a big wind came up like it does down there on the beach, and it rolled that machine up into a ball. So there's, again, Christmas time, we're going to get out of here. They bundled it up and went back home, and that airplane stayed in there in that condition for up until 1909, roughly, when MIT decided they like to show this around, and the Wright Brothers actually went in and got it out and put it together themselves, and that's the one that's been handed around. It spent the war in England.
Oh. Well, why didn't they display it in the Smithsonian from the very beginning?
Well, there's a little disharmony between the Smithsonian and the Wright Brothers. That's another whole story in itself, because the Smithsonian said that
Langley is the guy that
Langley flew first.
Yeah.
But his airplane did the same thing that the first flight of the 1903 flyer did. It went right in the water.
Yeah. But the Smithsonian sort of supported Langley, right?
Right, exactly. And so they went around and around. And so they said, well, at this point, of course, Orville said, well, when we get this, I don't want to give it to the Smithsonian now. So the other people had asked for it. The Scientific Museum in England got it just before the war. And of course, the war came up. They weren't going to ship it anyplace. So they dismantled it and put it in a safe place, I assume a tunnel someplace. And we didn't get it back to the museum until 1948.
So it's been displayed there
Ever
not
since.
quite ever since, but close
Oh
to.
Yeah, ever since.
Ever
It's
since.
been right there. Yeah.
That's it.
It hasn't gone.
Well, after they proved that they could fly, there must have been something that they began to develop other aircraft, or did they keep the same?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
They
built bigger engines, or?
They built another flyer, and then of course, every time they kept improving. They find what is this, and they kept little tweaking and tweaking. And the 1905 flyer is really considered the airplane that is an airplane. It could do everything, make turns.
So they could
stay
fly
up
in
the air.
circles. They demonstrated that.
Yep.
And how about a passenger? When did they put a passenger in?
They made. I don't know that for sure, but I know they made one when they went to sell it to the military.
Yeah.
And
Well, the military asked for it.
Yeah. And that was the next quantum jump, is selling it to the military. And
So do you remember the specifications that they had in the RFP, the request for proposal for an aircraft? They went up in 1908 first, didn't they?
Yeah, 1908.
And to demonstrate.
It was the same. No, it's the same requirement. They had the contract for 40 miles an hour, a passenger, being able to be portable, besides flying, and of course being able to fly for an hour. Yeah. So, but unfortunately, in the 1908 testing, actually they took several people up. Orville did, excuse me, and on one of the take-ups, a young man by the name of Lieutenant Selfridge, Tom Selfridge, he went up and the airplane got in some trouble. One of the propellers got shattered and he crashed.
Oh.
So that was a sad state of affairs. He was killed, the first passenger killed, and of course Orville got kind of banged up, but he came back again in 1909.
Well, actually, the Army put out once they did this, the Army put out a request for proposal for the aircraft to meet those conditions of 40 miles an hour, over 100 feet in the air.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And carrying a passenger, flying for an hour, and they came back in 1909 and with an aircraft that did that.
And that's a picture. I think we have a picture in there of that. One picture when they're just about to get into the airplane.
Well, that's flying there. That's the aircraft flying at that time.
Next one.
Then the next picture is Wilbur and
Yeah,
Orville.
there they are. Wilbur and Orville in the airplane.
In 08. They weren't together in 09, were they?
No, but this is a picture, a classic picture. I don't think they flew that. I don't know that particular flight.
Yeah, the next one shows the 1909.
Okay, there we are. No, that's 1909. They're getting ready to go, and he's going to take a passenger, and he got Lieutenant Floy, because Lieutenant Floy was only about 5'7", 5'8", weighed 150 pounds. He didn't want any more weight because he wanted to make sure he could get off.
Yeah, I would think you'd want to like it.
And they took off, and they went cross country trip all the way down to Alexandria, around the Masonic Temple, and then back. And he did that
from Fort Myer.
From Fort Myer.
Yeah.
And they got made it in record time, 42 miles an hour versus the 40, and the government said, hey, you've exceeded all the requirements. We'll give you $30,000 for the car instead of $25,000.
Okay. Well, we have about 2 minutes left, but while Orville was there selling the aircraft to the Army, Wilbur was over in Europe, right?
Oh, and doing well.
Yeah, he took it to France and to Germany.
He was dazzling him with his turns.
Yeah, and he became really a VIP.
Oh.
Oh, they treated him royally.
And the thing was, he didn't being typically, like I said, like they were, the very, very humble boys, he wasn't getting into all this stuff with counts and stuff. He just liked to fly, and he'd go fly and demonstrate. He'd come home and he went back to his room. And they said, "Well, you're supposed to be out here doing this." And no, he says, "I want to do it."
Yeah. Okay, well, and actually, they built two factories, one in France and one in Germany,
Right.
and that was the forerunner of the aircraft of World War I. Those people are the ones who began to improve it using ailerons instead of warped wings.
Oh yeah,
and so forth.
That's another whole ball game. You get into discussing the litigations over changing from wing warping, which the Wright brothers invented, into using ailerons, and then you really got some discussion, because then the lawyers got into the business, and so much so that nobody wanted to design an airplane, and here World War I was coming along, and America did not have an airplane.
Yeah.
So our folks flying in Europe all were using foreign airplanes.
Okay, well, let's recap. Let's have that last slide, and that shows the sequence of aircraft. We have go from the gliders of 1900 to the plane that flew in 1903.
Yep, all the way
And
down.
John, we've taken quite a trip here. We've gone from flying kites to building a plane that will fly, and so and selling it to the Army.
Well, I think you
And
also
that's where
got-
we started with the Air Force back in September. So
Well, I think you got to look at what they did, like in 6 years. What happened in 6 years? They flew across. Blériot flew across the Channel. 11 years, we put a machine gun in an airplane. They're shooting down each other. 24 years later, Lindbergh flies across the Atlantic. 44 years later, Chuck Yeager breaks the sound barrier, and 66 years later, we walk on the moon. So
that's
some compression of time.
That's some trip. Well, thank you very much for coming again today.
Well, I enjoyed it.